Hi everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all for this event. We are extremely fortunate to have with us a distinguished guest whose expertise and dedication in the field of climate and energy are truly remarkable. Please join with me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Rachel Cleetus, the Policy Director with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Dr. Cleetus brings nearly 20 years of invaluable experiences in working on US climate and clean energy policies. Her extensive background not only reflects a deep commitment to advancing climate solutions, but also showcases her leadership in shaping effective environmental strategies. Dr. Cleetus is also an esteemed expert on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process. Since 2009, she has been prominent present at international climate negotiations, contributing her profound knowledge and insight to discussions that are critical for global climate future. Her work continues to inspire and guide those who strive for meaningful change in the conflict against climate change. We are eager to hear her perspective and learn from her experiences as we engage in today's discussion. Dr. Cletus, thank you for being here and for your unwavering dedication to address one of the most urgent climate issues in Sri Lanka. We are looking forward to hear from you and gain insight from your extensive expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanadi, for that generous introduction. Thank you all for being here today. This is just such an honor to have a chance to have this dialogue with you. I hope I won't just be speaking at you. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well and the amazing efforts that you're engaged with. As Hansini said, young people truly are the thing that gives me hope right now in this moment. Your efforts and your connection with your environment are crucial so that the world is on a better path. Um, I'll share with you some of my experiences working in the space of advocating for equitable and just solutions to the climate crisis. Um, I also just want to share a little bit about my background and context, how I came to this work, in case it has any resonance for you as you embark on your path. I grew up in Delhi in India, and when I was growing up, I was very conscious about the connection between privilege and class and environmental pollution, and how already in a society, socioeconomic inequities were colliding with environmental injustices and exposing some people to heightened risks. And others were sort of almost walking through oblivious of the repercussions of their lifestyle choices on other people. And that sort of set me on this path of thinking about solutions to socioeconomic challenges that would always have an equity and justice lens to it, so that we weren't just talking about solving environmental problems, but really about improving people's lives, their health, etc. And I embarked on a choice of training as an economist. I came to the United States and studied economics in college and graduate school. And then at the time when I was in graduate school, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was just coming into birth, the Rio Summit, and from that flowing the UN Framework Convention, which even today, if you go back and look at that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it's really extraordinary. And I'm not sure that the world would right now in today's political environment would have signed on to a document like that. I know that the United States in particular has moved very far from the original intent of that document in terms of the responsibility that richer nations have to lead on addressing the climate crisis. And so it's still a document that serves as a guiding star for what the world could be like if we embarked on solving this collective challenge together, if we recognized each other's humanity and our shared, just the shared both responsibility and burden of solving this crisis. And in that original document, I think there is a very resonant piece for you all in Sri Lanka today, which is that the existential threat that climate poses to small island nations was recognized even in that original document. The idea that climate impacts like sea level rise would have such profound implications for everyone, but particularly for small island nations. And I guess one thing that for me has, over the course of my work in the space, become very clear is that whether you're talking about marginalized communities in the United States or the plight of developing countries, you have this kind of injustice built into the climate crisis, which is that often the people who've contributed the least to the crisis in terms of their carbon emissions are facing often the worst brunt of its impacts and have the fewest resources to help recover. But at the same time, another thing has become very clear is that you cannot see people as victims. What you're seeing is an extraordinary sort of ingenuity and thought and commitment from those who are bearing the worst brunt to solutions. People are in a very solutions oriented time frame, and what we need are the resources to implement those solutions. So this is not about another model of colonialism where there's some top down this is the set of solutions that must be implemented, but more this bottom up approach. And that's where I think the work that you all are doing in Sri Lanka is so important, because we do need resources from richer nations. But you all and the people you work with on the ground in Sri Lanka will know how best to implement solutions that actually work for you. That cannot come from the outside, because you understand what's most important, how to integrate it with other priorities the nation has, whether they be social goals, environmental goals, economic goals, gender justice goals. All of those things are very clear when you're working on the ground. And so keeping that sense of agency is very much a part of how we can implement better climate solutions. Maybe just to start a little bit with the science, I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a 55-year-old organization. It's a nonprofit. We're headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and have offices also in Washington, D.C., and in California, Chicago. And when we originally formed, it was around the idea of addressing the threats from nuclear weapons. So there were a bunch of scientists at universities here in the US who were very worried that the world was embarking on a very dangerous regime of weaponizing, and with nuclear weapons, the threat, again, an existential threat, was increasing, and that there was a real need for independent science to help guide good policy making. And since then, we've expanded. We now, climate change is one of our biggest programs working on climate change and climate solutions. And what today is still very much the ethos of how we do our work is the recognition that science belongs to everyone, and good science can help inform good policy making. It shouldn't just be an ivory tower thing that belongs to some elite set of folks who get PhDs. Science really, it's about translating that science in a way that's accessible to everyone is crucial, and that people's lived experiences are another way of thinking about empirical science. So it's not just the science in journals, but literally what people are noticing in their daily lives. And I say that because I imagine in the work that you're doing in Sri Lanka, there will be people you will talk to, for example, fisher folk or people who are working in the agricultural sector, who will have noticed changes in their livelihoods. They will have noticed changes in the oceans. They will have noticed the impacts of flooding, the impacts of land erosion, drought in their livelihoods. And that is as important a signal of how climate is affecting our lives as is the data that will come from major scientific agencies around the world. And what some of that science is showing, first of all, we're at a little, we're close to about 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels on a global average. But there are parts of the world that are experiencing faster, higher rates of temperature increase, and those tend to be the places that are further from the pole, from the equator. The poles are warming more rapidly, and at the same time, we're seeing that there is no safe temperature increase. Like a lot of times people think, oh, it's 1.5 C, but what we are recognizing is we're not even at 1.5 C and we're already seeing these very dangerous impacts. And one of the clearest signatures of climate change is the increase in extreme heat that we've seen globally around the world, including in Sri Lanka. And that extreme heat is coming earlier in the year. Heat waves are lasting longer. We've seen in Asia these sort of relentless heat waves again and again. Even this year, it came very early in the year. We were starting to see heat waves already in May, and these heat waves are lasting long periods of time. When you get these multi-day heat waves that last even through the night periods, it makes it very difficult for the human body to adjust. So you don't get that cooling opportunity at night. And the other challenges for places where people don't have a lot of resources, they may not have access to cooling, like air conditioning or desert coolers, and that just increases the exposure to the human health risks of heat. A lot of people are working outdoors, and that's their primary form of livelihood, and that means that they're exposed in while they're exerting their bodies. Again, the public health literature shows us that working outdoors in those kinds of conditions gets very dangerous. So this is a huge impact in Asia to be thinking about, and the data and science is showing that as our climate warms, this is going to be one of the biggest causes of human health impacts and even deaths because of climate-related extreme heat. The other major impact we're seeing, and Sri Lanka has been really experiencing this acutely, is extreme flooding events. And what we're seeing is with warmer temperatures, the storms that have always happened are able to carry more moisture with them. Warmer air can hold more water, and you get these very intense. When it rains, it's very intense. And now my parents live in Kerala, which is just across the water from you in Sri Lanka. The tropical climate is very similar, and we also experience these monsoon rain events. And so for a long time, we have been used to the idea that at certain times of year, there will be these very heavy rain events. But what's happening with climate change, and the science here is still evolving, is that the monsoon rain patterns are getting disrupted. And they're getting disrupted partly because of warming ocean temperatures, also the effects on the ocean, the way the Gulf Stream, et cetera, flowing are affecting patterns in the US. In other parts of the world, there are different ocean currents that are also being affected. And these impacts are happening in one sense slow, but on a geological timescale, on a human timescale, they're really accelerating as we're seeing temperatures warm. And so the disruption in the monsoon rainfall patterns, this science is still evolving, but this could be a hugely consequential impact of climate change because of how dependent many countries in Asia are on the cycle of monsoons for agricultural productivity. And then the other impact, of course, is that when you get these very heavy rainfall events, they're colliding with other environmental challenges. For example, a cutting of forests, which is leaving areas of land more prone to landslides and mudslides. Again, very dangerous to people, to property, to livelihoods, like agricultural livelihoods. And this is a pattern, again, we're seeing year on year, these kinds of intense flood events get worse. The other piece that's, again, a fingerprint of climate change is ironically the cycle between precipitation whiplash, where you get these heavy rainfall events and then drought events. So too much or too little water, and often not coming at the right times of the year for agricultural cycles, or being slightly mistimed. And this really matters, for example, for rice plantation, because we know that when it comes to planting rice, you have the seedlings, and then you need to transfer them at a very particular time of the year when you're expecting rain, so that they can flourish and you get an abundant crop. The reality is, if the rain comes too early or too late or too much, any of those things can affect significantly the amount of rice production that you get. And this is an impact that the science from the IPCC and others is showing that will impact Sri Lanka going forward. You know that the impacts on the rice crop are a real risk, and as a result of both the agricultural impacts and some of these other impacts I'm pointing out, there could be significant impacts on the GDP of Sri Lanka, even as early as mid-century. You could see, over 6% decline in GDP because of these combined climate impacts. And that's a lot in a country that's trying to bring people out of poverty and improve people's livelihoods. Climate is just this additional layer of risk that's pushing people back into poverty. And that's why we have to think about development, sustainable development programs that aren't just calibrated to the climate of today, but are really thinking about what's coming our way in the future. Um, the other piece of the science that's very sobering is that we're continuing to see global heat trapping emissions rise. Now, we know that the whole point of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, was that nations were supposed to be committing to a sharp decline in heat trapping emissions, and that richer countries were supposed to lead the way. And yet, year on year, we're seeing the data go in the opposite direction. Just recently, the US scientific agency, NOAA, put out a report talking about record heat trapping emissions last year across all heat trapping gases, all major ones, including carbon dioxide and methane. That's very, very worrying, because we know that the climate system has an inertia built into it. Even if we turn off all heat trapping emissions tomorrow, we're going to continue to see the Earth systems warm because of the energy that's built into the system, and that will continue to drive climate change. And then the other final very sobering piece that you all are experiencing firsthand is sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of those clear signatures of climate change again. We know that around the world, sea levels are rising. We've seen approximately 8 or 9 inches since the Industrial Revolution, global average around the world. But in different parts of the world, because of local factors like land subsidence, that sea level rise can be higher and faster. And sea level rise, while people think sometimes that a few centimeters, what does that mean? What we're seeing right now is that it's accelerating, and that it's already causing a lot of coastal infrastructure, a lot of population centers on our coastlines to be affected. Now, all around the world, including in Sri Lanka, humans have developed so that there is a significant amount of the world's population located along coastlines, and that's true in Sri Lanka as well. And that means that you have a lot of people exposed as the sea level rise is accelerating. And it's not just what you're seeing over the land, it's also that the water is coming up from underneath. So wherever the substrate is porous, the seawater is coming in further, and that can start to intrude into freshwater supplies, creating a real challenge, because we all need that fresh water. That's a survival resource. And this is a particular challenge that small island nations face, because freshwater supplies are limited, and when they're affected by saltwater intrusion, you can very quickly get a whole lot of people suddenly with water scarcity issues. So thinking about these challenges in a holistic way, taking the scientific projections into account, that's going to be crucial as we're thinking about sustainable development. And that's why, what we're trying to do here in the US, and I think a very important part of the work that you're doing in Sri Lanka is making sure that our policymakers today are aware as they're planning, making decisions about long-lived infrastructure or development plans, that they're thinking about this warming climate of the future and making sure that the investments we're making today are taking account of those risks and being smart about the choices so that we're not further exposing people to climate risks. In the international arena, this is an important moment we're at because in the Paris Agreement that was came into being in 2015 and has now been adopted by most of the nations of the world, there was an understanding that we would have to continue to improve our efforts to address climate change. And there was, you might be aware that there's this cycle called the nationally determined contributions, where nations make a commitment that they will cut emissions, and then they've agreed to revisit it and improve upon it going forward. What we're coming up against is the next cycle of the NDCs. We're also coming up against the next cycle of a new quantified goal for climate finance, what's often called the NCQG. All of these are going to be determined by early next year. And what we need right now, given the accelerating climate crisis, we need nations, especially richer nations, to accelerate and increase their ambition in terms of cutting emissions. We also need richer nations to lead on providing more climate finance so that countries that have fewer resources are able to invest in an energy transition away from fossil fuels, are able to invest in adaptation, can address loss and damage from climate change. And Sri Lanka, by all rights, in a world with climate justice, deserves those resources. And again, this is not supposed to be the framework here should not be foreign aid that depends on whether rich countries feel like it or not. The frame here is climate justice, because the reason nations like Sri Lanka are suffering these acute challenges is primarily because of the emissions from richer countries like the United States. The United States is, on a historical basis, the largest contributor to heat trapping emissions globally, cumulative heat trapping emissions. And that means that it has a unique responsibility to help address the challenge and provide the finance. What we're seeing is richer nations again and again falling short on those finance commitments. And so we're really putting pressure to build a campaign for a more robust finance pledges the next time around. You may have heard that richer nations had pledged 100 billion a year by 2020, and they did not meet that pledge. They have just finally, maybe if you agree with their maths, just met it last year. And the COVID crisis, meanwhile, took a huge toll on development priorities in many countries, including Sri Lanka, because there was a big economic downturn that was experienced by the world, but most acutely by those who live in poverty, nations that were very much squeezed by fossil fuel price spikes that happened as a result of the Ukraine war, and all of these combined forces. So, because the debt crisis has worsened as a result of these factors, the climate finance piece is even more important, because nations are not only needing the finance to deal with climate issues, they have even less now because they're dealing with the debt crisis and the overhang from that debt crisis that continues to affect developing nations. And so in this context, I think the biggest priorities right now are to push for climate justice. And I repeat the phrase climate justice a lot because many people think about climate change as an emissions challenge, and they're used to thinking about it in terms of the science of heat trapping emissions. But the reality is that how people experience climate change has to do with these layers of injustice that already exist, socioeconomic inequities, and climate is just the latest layer of risk. And what it's doing right now is compounding the challenges that nations face in terms of advancing development. But what I see as the bright spot here is that there are really important opportunities where we can have win-win solutions. When you take the energy transition, for example, the dependence on fossil fuels is not just contributing to the climate crisis, it causes an acute public health crisis already today because there are so many emissions from burning fossil fuels, everything from sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, mercury. These are all very, very harmful to human health and are already killing millions of people around the world. So the transition of fossil fuels makes a lot of sense for here and now reasons, as well as addressing climate change. And meanwhile, we're seeing the costs of renewable energy fall dramatically around the world. It is often the cheapest form of energy, new energy to install. And so if we can just invest in accelerating that transition, it will pay off very quickly in terms of public health benefits, in terms of economic benefits. Fossil fuel prices are incredibly volatile, and for island nations in particular, that is a huge cost. You know, that dependence on fossil fuels exposes countries to all the volatility in the global fossil fuel energy market. When the Ukraine crisis hit, for example, that war, there was a lot of attention on the impact in Europe. The reality is the countries that often had even worse impacts were countries in Asia and Africa that were having to pay these exorbitant energy costs to meet their energy needs. So getting off fossil fuels is a really important way to insulate from those global dynamics of fossil fuel price spikes. The other really bright spot is when you think about this in the context of advancing a sustainable development agenda, there are so many solutions that can help advance sustainable development that also improve climate resilience. Just on a very basic level, having access to safe, affordable shelter um, and public health resources makes a community more resilient. Just ensuring that people have housing, that they have safe places, that when there is an extreme disaster, that people can be quickly taken out of harm's way. These are basics to help address disaster response and sustainable development, but they also contribute to climate resilience. And this is a place where I personally have spent a lot of time thinking about lessons that countries like the United States can learn from the context of the so-called developing countries. Um, you know, one example is that for as tropical cyclones have worsened, we have seen some really low tech but important ways to get many, many people out of harm's way that have been pioneered in places like the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, where you use SMS text systems to quickly get the message out to many, many people, including fisher folk who might be out on the ocean, but also coastal land residents, to warn them. And then you have publicly accessible resources like buses and trucks to get people away from the coastline if needed to very rudimentary shelter. Nothing fancy, but a place where people can go, can be safe, and there's food provision. These are the kinds of low tech ways that I think can really help ensure if we have good early warning systems. And again, having the science and the data to set up those early warning systems is a big UN priority. um, if you have those early warning systems in place, you can really save lives, even as these tropical cyclones might be worsening because of climate change. And I think this is the lesson for countries like the United States. You know, here, when we have hurricanes, which are also oftentimes getting more intense, carrying more rainfall, the warming oceans means that they are intensifying more rapidly as they approach land. We are still in a world where most people have to figure out how to get out of harm's way themselves. And you may have seen the images from Hurricane Katrina and other major hurricanes in the United States, where oftentimes it's the people with the least resources who get stranded. They may not have a car, they may not have money for gas, they may not have money for a hotel, and so they're left, in that place that exposes them to risk. So the idea that there is a social good here, there is a public service that governments can take responsibility for providing to help keep their people safe. That's a really important lesson because individual people on their own, this is just too big a challenge. It's too daunting. There are too many aspects to it. And there really is need for good public policy and government investment to help people get out of harm's way. And then I guess the final piece, and I'd love to hear more from you all, is that I think there's a really important space here for narrative and storytelling to connect people with each other across the world in understanding how this crisis is affecting them and what they see as solutions to help improve their lives. Because it's all too easy for us to get in a fortress world mentality where people who have resources just think about, saving and guarding themselves. And we have to puncture that, we have to pierce that to create a shared humanity here so that people understand, oh, that sea level rise, it's happening here in Florida, it's happening in Sri Lanka, it's happening in Bangladesh, and people really feeling that connection. I think it's going to be really important to us dealing with this challenge collectively. And the younger generation, this is all about the world you will be living in. It is with a great deal of grief, I think, and guilt that the generations that come before you must face that we have fallen short, and it will be up to you to carry the torch forward and finding ways for you all to do that in a really connected world so that we don't just default to the political boundaries and barriers. Um, it's going to be critical because climate change, unfortunately, will displace a lot of people from places that may not be safe anymore. And people must be met with welcoming arms if unfortunately they find themselves displaced. We have to create a global ethos that takes responsibility, sees people's shared humanity. And so I'll stop there, but would love to take questions and hear your perspectives. I'm really sorry to apologize up front. I do have to drop after an hour, so unfortunately won't be able to stay for the full hour and a half, but would love to hear from you.
Yes, Dr. Sir, thank you so much for actually like telling us how it impacts us. Like I genuinely had no clue. Like I had a basic understanding, but not as in depth as I was getting to know from your details as well. So we have a few questions prepared for you, which hopefully allows us as the younger generation to understand better, like section wise, to actually grasp the situation of what's going on in climate change in regards of Sri Lanka. And so the topic would be focusing on impacts affecting Sri Lanka, like climate change's impact on Sri Lanka. First question would be, uh, next slide. Yeah. In your view, what are the most urgent climate impacts facing Sri Lanka, and how do they compare to those experienced in other countries? So, since you've said that you were brought up in India and you're currently in the USA, and you've definitely have had such a broad understanding about the global standing as well. So, can we know some similar like geographic and climatic conditions? Like, what do they go through? What do you think would be helpful for us in going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenges you face are extreme heat, the flooding, these intensified tropical storms, and the heavy precipitation and flooding, and then sea level rise, which, it happens in this way that is much slower. People think of it as a slow moving disaster, but it's nevertheless as urgent as some of these other impacts. And that's the physical side of it. What I would say is that then you overlay that with where people live and draw their livelihoods from, and you see the acute vulnerabilities. So we know that things like the agricultural sector in Sri Lanka will be very exposed. We know that the warming oceans will affect fisheries. Many people depend both for their livelihoods as well as their source of protein on fish. So these are the kinds of ways, you have to think about both the physical layer and then the vulnerability that comes from exposure to that physical risk. I would say freshwater supplies and access, water issues related to saltwater intrusion. That's another challenge in island nations, that is really important to be aware of, because safeguarding those supplies, creating catchments where you're getting rainwater, capturing rainwater as a source of fresh water, which feels ironic when you have heavy, heavy rains and there's too much water. But finding ways to regularize that water flow, that's really critical. It's unfortunately all too common an experience, that these physical risks are very similar in other parts of the world, but the unique vulnerabilities that get created by the social risk piece, that's something that's very important to recognize and make it context specific when you're talking about Sri Lanka.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, to be honest. Like how it's actually a shared experience among the Asian countries. And yes, and I believe you answered our second question as well. The second question we had prepared was how we can, yes, what the strategies and best practices would have been. So, in I would assume this answers part of our question because you said collecting rainwater and taking
Yeah,
such
I mean,
precautionary. Yes, sorry,
I,
you can.
I think the first most important thing is, given the latest science, it's really important to map your vulnerabilities, like understand where your risks and vulnerabilities are in a really localized way. And to the extent possible, you take science like the IPCC science or other science that's being generated and really try to create localized versions that are accessible to people and the public, because different regions, different parts of the country will have to understand what does it mean for me here where I live, and that's
Exactly.
actually painstaking work. It's work that it's important to signal that policymakers need this kind of science. I will also say that what you mentioned deforestation here, and I think this is where we recognize that there deforestation isn't caused by climate change necessarily. You have parts of the world where tropical forests are under stress, drought stress, etc. So, or wildfire stress, and you can get loss of forest. But even cutting down forests is contributing emissions, and that deforestation makes land more vulnerable to landslides and mudslides when there's heavy rain. So when we're investing in reforestation efforts, for example, we have to be sure, first of all, they're ecologically informed, that we're not doing monoculture and creating other challenges through it, but that we recognize that areas that have denuded landscapes are now going to be more exposed. For the same rainfall, they're going to be more exposed to risks. I think given the importance of the oceans to Sri Lanka, ocean acidification and sea level rise, these two impacts, unfortunately, are very long duration impacts. They will continue for centuries, even if we sea level rise, in particular, will continue even if we cut emissions overnight. And ocean acidification affects the ecosystems in the ocean, the fisheries, and particularly affects the shell forming organisms. The change in pH in the water affects their ability to form shells. So that has a real impact. I think you mentioned some work you're doing on mangroves and mangrove plantations. Those are incredibly important pieces of work, because mangroves are life sustaining. They're not only helping keep shorelines stable and help with flood mitigation, they're also the nurseries for shellfish and all the ocean ecosystems that depend on that. So those kinds of efforts, they can also be livelihood efforts where you create small scale industries where people can be paid to invest in mangrove plantations. So creating those kinds of programs where there is some money for people to engage in those kinds of efforts, and that creates livelihood opportunities, that's really important.
Right, doctor. So, since there's a couple of other countries, other regions of the world which have gone through similar experiences, would you say that there were any successful attempts in like taking better climate change actions?
So I think there are a lot of efforts around the world, but they're falling in broadly two categories. One is that people are continuing to develop on coastlines because the coastlines are so attractive for other economic reasons. They're economic centers, so people migrate to the coastlines, and that's actually creating a maladaptive outcome. Yeah, we actually have more people exposed to things like sea level rise, etc. And then one reaction is to harden infrastructure, try to build seawalls and things like that. And the science shows that those kinds of attempts, like they can buy you time, but they're not going to be able to keep the seas out forever. And in many cases, when you build a hard wall here, you just push the impacts to communities that are on the other sides of that wall. And then seawalls will never protect against water that comes from underneath, the saltwater intrusion that we were talking about. So, unfortunately, a lot of the efforts we're seeing right now are still falling short in terms of the true resilience. And that's why what I mentioned about mangroves, like working with nature, the natural resilience means these have the most promise. And they really, it's really important to be thinking along those lines. We are going to have to learn to live with water. That's just a reality. We will not be able to stop the oceans from rising. So, how can we integrate the water into our ways of being? I think that's and live with nature in that way. That's going to be really important. Maybe one thing that will sound not an adaptation measure, but is really important, is many jurisdictions around the world are now starting to take up lawsuits against fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel companies who have lied about climate science. They knew that burning their product would cause these impacts decades ago. And many of these large multinational companies are continuing to expand fossil fuels. They lobby against fossil fuel, any policy to address climate change, both in places like the United States and even in the UNFCCC at the COP. We've seen record numbers of fossil fuel company representatives show up in these international climate negotiations. And so, how are countries going to be able to pay for adaptation measures? One really important channel is litigation efforts. And we're seeing countries, Bangladesh is one of these countries. We've seen even subnational jurisdictions like cities and states in the United States launch legal litigation efforts against fossil fuel companies. UCS helps provide some of the climate science that underpins some of these litigation efforts by tying the emissions from the products that these companies are producing to climate impacts like extreme heat and sea level rise. And so that's something to consider, especially as young people. Your futures are at stake, and is there an opportunity to think about a pathway for a litigation effort that would put fossil fuel companies in the limelight and put the accountability on them and create a stream of revenue that could be used for adaptation measures?
Right, doctor. Also, on the line of understanding better as to how the younger generation could contribute, is there any sort of data collection methods or like available sets of data that maybe even UCS uses like to refer to or makes actually like worthwhile decisions from it?
Sure. I can share some resources with you through email afterwards. But one of the things that we try to do, we have a climate hub for litigation, and what we do is we're not generating all the science ourselves. Like we have done some of the research ourselves, but what we're also trying to do is connect scientists to people who need the science. So one way to think about this is we're trying to create a hub that's global in nature, where scientists on the ground everywhere are able to generate the kind of science that will be useful to communities. Here in the US, we have something called the National Climate Assessment, which is kind of like the IPCC for the world. It is a US version of it, and we're trying to create pressure for more localized scientific data and information. The next round of the IPCC is just getting underway, and it's really, really important to have scientists from places like Sri Lanka represented on the author teams and the review teams, so that that science can be generated that is local. Right now, we have an overrepresentation of science in places like
Europe.
Europe and the US, and we need more of that. So you all are training as scientists, some of you, I imagine. Thinking about that in the Sri Lanka context is really, really important. You can use the same methods, but localizing it to collecting data in Sri Lanka and making sure that there's a long-term data collection efforts, that you have a trend there. It's not just a year-to-year thing, but that you're maintaining a trend. That's really very important. Then the final piece is the early warning systems that I mentioned. There is a huge effort from the UN to ensure within this decade that early warning systems are available everywhere in the world. That is another piece of monitoring systems that are crucial in the context of Sri Lanka.
Right. Uh, so, in order to like better understand how we are being perceived from the international perspective, may we know whether how are we currently viewed? Like, do does the international stage think that we are currently completely doomed, or how is it
Well,
worthwhile?
I think no one gets to decide that for another country. So I hope you all don't feel that way. I think the role of Sri Lanka is very much in keeping with the role of uh, the nations who are on the forefront of these crises and have contributed the least to causing it. So Sri Lanka has a really important moral voice because uh, you're experiencing some very acute impacts. The nation as a whole has hardly any heat trapping emissions when you consider the global scale here. So, what I do think is important is that Sri Lanka, in its NDCs, its nationally determined contribution, the next one that it puts forth, really represent the adaptation and the loss and damage piece very clearly. So, not just actions to cut emissions, which I
Yeah.
think representing a good transition away from fossil fuels and what will it take to achieve that, off grid technologies, energy storage, all of the pieces that will be needed in addition to renewable energy and transmission, thinking about every sector, not just the power sector, but transportation, etc. But representing the adaptation and loss and damage in the NDC is very important because that's what signals to richer countries, oh, there's a larger obligation here. It's not just cutting emissions. Richer nations also have to help support those efforts for adaptation and having good plans in place, because oftentimes the excuse that richer nations use is that, well, how's the money actually going to be used? And we keep saying, well, unlock the money. Countries know how to use it. They know how
Yeah.
best to use it. So the adaptation planning part, I think, is something that Sri Lanka can really lead the way on in terms of
Yeah.
pointing out what's possible in the context of sustainable development and climate resilience.
Okay. Also, Dr. We actually have a few more questions, but at the same time, you'd have to leave in about 5-10 minutes, right? So, would it be fine if you open the Q&A
Sure,
session?
absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. So, guys, it's your time to send in any questions. If you feel like unmuting and asking away, please do. Otherwise, you can send it on the chat and we can read it out for you. Uh, she'll be here for like 5 minutes. So yes. Oh, Sahasra. Yes, you can. Yes, go on.
Hi, so I believe I'm audible. Am I?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Cleetus, hello. And first of all, I have to thank you for being the guest speaker for today because through your speech, we got to know a lot of new information, which for me, I haven't really even had heard of them. So my question for you is, would you be able to provide some examples for us of successful early warning systems to extreme weather conditions? And when it comes to Sri Lankan context, how we would be able to develop them and to improve it on our system.
Sure. So these early warning systems have long been recognized as a way of even having 24 hours notice can literally save thousands of lives. And this is a very hard one lesson that I think that is specifically the experience of countries that have these strong tropical cyclones where in the past people would just be caught unawares, or they wouldn't have a sense of how big or how long the storm would last. And that has been the genesis of thinking about early warning systems that apply across a number of climate impacts, including extreme heat waves. And the idea is really using low tech, because you don't want to make this so complicated or so expensive that it'll be impossible to implement. And the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres a couple of years ago said within the next 5 years, we want to have early warning systems everywhere in the world for all of humanity. We're behind on meeting that, and it is because of resource constraints. But one of the really important aspects of it is that the science to inform early warning systems can be created globally. And the United States, like our science agencies are actually, they're monitoring conditions around the world, as are European agencies. And the idea is that that science, you can piggyback on that science to help create localized extreme weather forecasting systems that could be used in Sri Lanka, could be used in countries in Africa, elsewhere. And I think what's really important for these early warning systems is that there be local meteorologists and scientists who are tapping into the science directly and contributing to it, so that it's not just always a system that's run from elsewhere, but there is really an understanding of where the data is generated, where the monitoring stations are, making sure that there's a better coverage of monitoring and early warning systems in places where it's been hard to access and reach. And so I'm not aware right now of what specifically Sri Lanka is doing in terms of early warning systems, but I would really encourage you all to find out, contact your local meteorological departments and ask them these questions. The SMS tech system has just been an incredible thing to watch how it's mushroomed in the last 10 years. So having a system like that in place, a national system that immediately sends out warnings when you have these extreme conditions arriving. I know, sadly, in the case of Sri Lanka, in the wake of the tsunami, that is one of the things that the government was thinking of investing in. And that is a system that can be multi-purpose. You can create it for a tsunami, but you can also then piggyback other kinds of impacts on it. So again, I think the emergency response system is our first line defense on any kind of extreme disaster.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
There's another question from.
Hey, Dr. Cleetus. I have a question about the climate-related technologies that has been implemented in other countries. Are there any technologies that where Sri Lanka can learn from and implement those?
Sure. When it comes to the clean energy transition, I think this is one where there really are globally shareable lessons learned. So one thing that's really unique about so-called, I use the word developing countries really advisedly. I really don't like that phrase, but just to say the shared experience of countries like Sri Lanka, India, and others. Uh, the thing is that we're never going to get grid connected electricity in every corner of the countries. It's sometimes that last mile is too expensive and may take too long. But that doesn't mean that we cannot have access to energy and clean energy resources, because off grid technologies are cheap. And the implementing them with storage attached to it, so solar plus storage, biogas plus storage, creating systems where people can actually access clean energy resources is both good for climate, the environment, but also can create livelihood opportunities. And I would say, like, expanding those kinds of opportunities in Sri Lanka, that's a lesson that's easily replicable and scalable from other parts of the world. There's a lot of South-South cooperation around clean energy technologies. On the climate resilience side, I think it's really important to think about it as a systems approach. So it's not a techno fix so much as thinking about your healthcare system, thinking about your housing system, your agricultural system, and coming up with a systems approach to how do you deal with, for example, extreme weather conditions like extreme rainfall or extreme temperatures, coming up with new varieties of agricultural seed, new irrigation systems that are more conducive to this warming climate. Those are the kinds of measures that can be adopted in places like Sri Lanka, and there are really good lessons from other parts of the world and how to do that. I think Sri Lanka itself might have some important lessons because rice and tea are two very unique aspects of the agricultural landscape where in real time you're learning lessons in Sri Lanka about what's working, what's not working, and how you're going to have to adjust as the climate changes. So it's a two-way lesson sharing that I think has to happen because there will be some ingenuity that will come from the ground up in terms of solutions.
Thank you very much.
I'm so sorry. I do have to leave right now, and I'm sorry for the miscommunication around the time. I had assumed an hour, and I'm booked for another appointment. I should have really put aside more time. I apologize for that. But I'm happy to follow up with more resources. I know I didn't get to all your questions, so let me know if sharing some resources in writing would be helpful. I'm happy to point you to some data resources as well in case those are helpful for your efforts. And I'd love to hear from you as well. So please do share with me some work you're doing. And if any of you are going to be at the COP, the UNFCCC COP, please let me know. It would be great to connect on the ground.
Yes, doctor, no worries. It's all good. So sorry about it. We'll call it a day then. Sanadi?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Good luck in all your efforts. Take care. And you're an inspiration. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us, doctor.